Good evening, everyone. Y'all ready to get started? I want to say welcome to the AIA Las Vegas May member meeting, and thank you all for being here. They're a great-looking group, and we've filled the room, so I'm very happy. I want to say a special thank you to Southern Nevada Strong for sponsoring this meeting. The purpose of Southern Nevada Strong is to develop regional support for long-term economic success and stronger communities by integrating reliable transportation, quality housing, and for all income levels, and job opportunities throughout Southern Nevada. I am pleased that we can be here this evening, so let's give them a round of applause for sponsoring. As a part of our Blueprint for Better theme this year, we're focusing on the importance of affordable housing and some of the best practices that have been employed successfully in other communities. This meeting will serve as a prep for our planned charrette, which is being held in August, where you can participate in an all-day session to devise solutions for these issues here in Las Vegas. If you're interested in being a part of that charrette, then please let us know by signing up for the event on the sheet that is being circulated right now through the group. And don't be shy. I mean, sign up. It's going to be a wonderful chance for us to really put our heads together and come up with some solutions to the problems that are really plaguing Las Vegas with affordable housing and homelessness. We can make a difference. So we will be, if you sign up, then we will follow up with you with full details of where and when and what time and how we're doing it and everything. To begin tonight's program, I am pleased to introduce the president of AIA Las Vegas, Dwayne Eschenbach, who just signed up.
Thank you, Randy. I think there's a flaw on that form, though, because there's a yes and a no box. There should only be a yes box. Thanks again to Southern Nevada Strong and to each of you for attending tonight's program. I need to do something with this mic because it's kind of low. Let's try this. We'd like to recognize and thank the firms and individuals who support our chapter through sponsorships. We're very proud to have the support and partnership of our visionary sponsors: John A. Martin and Associates, Clyde Juba Wald Lecture Series. Our platinum sponsors are FEA Consulting Engineers, Harris Consulting Engineers, NV5 Company, Nevada Sales Agency, TJK Consulting Engineers, and our official photographer is 501 Studios. Thank them. Also, our thanks tonight to our gold sponsors: American Insurance and Investment, Assurance Limited, Locksaw Engineering, Southwick Landscape Architects, Terp Consulting. Thank you all. And our silver sponsors are AIA Landscape Architecture, Bank of Nevada, Core Construction, DC Building Group, and Lodge Design. Thank you all. When discussing and navigating through the complex topic of affordable housing, architects and others are often discouraged by bureaucracy, NIMBYism, or simply left with more questions than answers on how to solve this problem. Our January membership meeting brought together a panel of experts to educate our membership about the issues surrounding affordable housing and homelessness in Southern Nevada, with a focus on how we can collectively join the efforts already in progress to end homelessness in our community. Tonight, we're going to hear from 3 distinguished architects about how they work, about their firms, and what they're doing to provide affordable housing solutions within their respective communities of Oakland, California, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. I think it's probably pretty fair to say that those cities have been struggling with the issue at a much larger scale for a longer period of time than we have here in Las Vegas. So tonight we're here to learn, we're here to be inspired, and to take away whatever we can to ensure that we position ourselves to become an integral community partner in solving our affordable housing crisis here in Southern Nevada. Following the three presentations tonight, there will be a panel discussion with time for Q&A from all of you at the end. So as they're talking, start thinking about questions you might have relative to our community. Our first speaker is Teresa Ballard Diaz, AIA, a senior associate principal with Piatak Architects in Oakland, California. With 18 years of experience practicing multifamily residential architecture and student housing. A member of Piatak's design committee, her leadership role in the office elevates design quality and production standards while promoting project delivery goals in the community at large. Diaz is a committed advocate of affordable housing and preventing all causes of homelessness, and has served for 12 years on the board of directors for Adobe Services, a local nonprofit dedicated to ending homelessness. She's a former planning commissioner for Newark, California. Caroline Souza, AIA, is an associate with David Baker Architects in San Francisco. Is that correct? San Francisco. And the project architect for a 100% affordable mid-rise for local and formerly homeless families currently under construction in San Francisco's housing-crunched Mission District. Caroline is an active member of the Emerging Leaders Peer Network Steering Committee, working to develop expertise and knowledge for affordable housing practitioners and advocates. Angie Brooks, FAIA, and some of you may recognize the name. Her partner, Larry, was up here for the Mayor's Housing Symposium a couple of months ago. Angie is managing principal at Brooks Scarpa in Los Angeles and is a recognized leader in the field of environmental and sustainable design and construction. She has pioneered more holistic ways of delivering affordable housing, sustainable architecture, and advances in social equity. She's also co-founder and past president of Livable Places, Inc., a nonprofit development company dedicated to building sustainable mixed-use housing in the city of Los Angeles on underutilized and problematic parcels of land as a reaction against Southern California's suburban sprawl. Let's give our three visiting guests a round of applause. In the front seat, wearing green, our very own Monica Gresser, AIA, from Brazen Architecture, is our panel discussion moderator tonight. Monica Gresser, NCARB AIA Lead AP, is the principal architect for Brazen Architecture, a firm dedicated to providing professional services for higher education, public work, commercial enterprises, nonprofits, and neglected neighborhoods. She currently serves on the City of Las Vegas Homeless Advisory Committee and is champion for the City of Las Vegas and the Southern Nevada Regional Planning Coalition Continuum of Care. Joint Housing Working Group. That's a long title, Monica. She is a member of the American Institute of Architects and the National Association of Women in Construction. Now that the introductions are done, Teresa, the podium is all yours. Welcome, Teresa.
Okay. Okay. So I'll tell you a little bit about Piatak Architects. We are about 40 people. We keep being almost 40 people, and then we get an intern, and then we lose an intern. And established about 35 years ago by Mike Piatak, who is a professor and practitioner of architecture. He lived... Okay. It's not going to fall. Yeah. Better? Better. Okay, he grew up in public housing and has that lived experience of how well-managed affordable housing can stabilize communities, and wanted to take good design and offer it to disenfranchised communities. And so we have a very mission-based practice focused on equitable and inclusive design processes, All of our work is multifamily housing. Some is mixed use, some is planning, but it's all multifamily housing. We do student housing and market rate, but our core mission is affordable housing. So I heard, let's see. It's not clicking. Technical difficulties. There we go. Thank you, Karen. Okay, so when I was a disillusioned college student, hearing all these fellow architecture students talk about my tower, my design, I heard Mike Piatak come and speak, and so I sought out an internship in his office and then went to work there after I graduated. That's me. This was the earliest community workshop photo that I could find. This was from 2004. I'm very pregnant. You can't see that there. So I grew up at Piatak and very much believe in the different outcome that we can have on projects where we have a very rich community engagement process. So I shouldn't have used so many effects on PowerPoint because it's going to take a while. So my married name is Diaz, and when my kids were young, for a while I did have a practice with a partner, Struthers Diaz Architects. So sometimes you hear Diaz, sometimes you hear Ballard. I had my nasty woman reaction a couple of years ago and decided to embrace the maiden name. So I came back to Piatak in 2014 after 6 years with Struthers Diaz Architects, but and so did my business partner too. So the other part of my background is for 12 years, and I termed out, that's the only reason it's not longer, was on the board of Abode Services. And that used to be Tri-City Homeless Coalition, maybe just the space bar. And it was about a $1.5 million organization when I joined, and they were having a heart attack because their next year's budget was going to be $3 million. And over the years, they merged with other nonprofits and have grown to be the largest homeless services provider in the Bay Area. Their budget is something like $70 million now. And so I learned a lot through that process. And I learned a lot because they deliver services. They also do affordable housing development. So I've been through many projects on the developer side of the table, and they do property management. So I understand those competing concerns between property management and the service provider, which can both be playing tug of war about different outcomes in a building design. Okay. So I don't have to tell you that the housing crisis is linked to homelessness and that it's expensive. But Santa Clara County actually did the math, and it's staggering, $520 million a year on not housing, but just emergency services, dealing with the fact that people are living their lives in the public way. Police, shelter, emergency room visits that don't have to happen if somebody is stably housed. So Santa Clara County decided to bet on that and enter into a Pay for Success program. This is a public-private partnership where a private investment group actually put the money up front for homeless services. And the county, now saving that money each year, pays the money to the investors over time. So the investors are getting a return on their investment, and the county is getting services delivered up front without having had to have a big pot of money for that in the beginning. So Abode Services was the service provider that was contracted to deliver services to the top, like 125 chronically homeless people in the county, who were individually sought out and said, you've been identified because you're the person with the most ER visits, whatever, and will you come and join this program? And UCSF is also a partner in the program, and they're documenting it. It's a 6-year program. It started in 2015. So I think we are soon going to see other communities who will see this actual documented experience, data of how much money communities can save if they will just invest in housing now. Okay, next. So this was so much a topic of conversation in Santa Clara County that the next year the voters approved a $950 million affordable housing bond, which is the biggest one that I know of in the state of California. And it's mostly for supportive housing targeted, at least 3/4 of it targeted at supportive housing for formerly homeless. Next slide. So this was a screenshot from 2016 when at a board meeting they were presenting some of the data. And you can see there's a drop off at the 0 point on this chart, and everything to the left represents services being engaged by this group of recipients who were chronically homeless in the county. You can see spikes during the winter months when there's more need for shelter. These are police engagements, these are ER visits, these are shelter stays. They didn't have tracking data for those individuals extending very far back. That's why it doesn't go very far back. But look at the drop-off once housing is provided. Thank you. So Monica and I were having a conversation about the Housing Authority's ability to provide vouchers, but with the increasing cost of housing, the voucher value doesn't always match up to the actual cost that landlords are looking for. So another special thing about the Housing Authority in Santa Clara County is that they are a moving to work housing authority, which is an experiment on the part of HUD to give housing authorities flexibility with the rules and decide when to bend them. So next slide. There's only 37 of those in the country, so hopefully they're learning valuable lessons about what policies to change through that process. But one of the things that Santa Clara County does is they pay the difference between the value of that HUD approves as a fair market rent and the actual rent. And I think, looking at this map, the Housing Authority here might be one of them. So somebody might be interested to find out what experiments the Housing Authority here is doing with new policies. Okay, another way that affordable housing, and especially rapidly creating affordable housing is done is through motel conversions. The one on the left is done through a master lease with the motel owner who gets to still get income each month, but it's run by a nonprofit who supports their tenants, their formerly homeless tenants. The one on the right is an acquisition. And so Abode owns that property, and they'll probably redevelop it at a higher density in the future, but in the meantime, that's one of the sites where those 125 folks in Santa Clara County are being housed. Okay. There's been a lot of talk about other rapid ways of doing it, and modular is a big thing, especially the volumetric modular, where we're shipping whole rooms and corridors on the highway. And this was supposed to be like a temporary modular project. It's been at least 5 years of community opposition now, and at this point the city has said, let's just make it be permanent because this fight is too hard. But it's too bad it's all just going to be one story, but it looks like it's actually finally happening. Okay. So in the meantime, the homeless situation is getting worse. This is in Oakland. And so the city has decided to invest several $1 million in creating these villages of tough sheds to get people quickly off the street and at least get the rain off of their heads. So these folks in the picture are my coworkers. My boss, Mike Piatak, is on the mayor's committee for homelessness, and they were out here building accessibility ramps and putting insulation inside the walls of the shed. It's a very controversial project because it's a lot of money being spent on a solution that's not a permanent solution. So some of the ways that affordable housing, well, I should say housing first, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that term, is a philosophy of approach to homelessness of that the solution to homelessness is homes. It's not, sobriety, and it's not employment. Those things can follow when somebody is stably housed. And not necessarily everybody is going to be able to achieve those things either. I mean, there are, for some people, for a certain percentage of people, there are real barriers to why they haven't been able to maintain housing without outside help. So all of those things, though, are not transitional housing, which still has the stress of knowing that there's an end date marching ahead for you, and not shelter. So that's part of why there's a lot of fighting about what the right solutions are. Okay. We have some great tools in California for how to get closer to feasibility for projects. The density bonus law says that any site anywhere in the state, whatever the zoning density is, an affordable housing project can increase that density by 35%. And whatever the parking requirement is, the city can't require that of this project. Here's this reduced parking requirement. That's all that project has to achieve. We are looking at potentially Senate Bill 50, which would be huge, that's going to go even further than that, and maybe have some limitless zoning in some places. But one of the most profound things is that it would end single-family zoning in the state of California, that any site that's zoned for single-family could have up to 3 units, if not 4 units. I think 4 units with city approval, but up to 3 units without city approval. So that will be huge. Okay, go to the next one. And I think neighbor objection is probably one of the, if not the hugest obstacle that we face with a lot of our affordable housing projects. So we use engagement processes, not just to help a community, a disenfranchised community, to discover and uncover and share with us what they prioritize for their community, but also to help neighbors get educated about what affordable housing really is. I know another thing that like Abode Services did is they acquired a parcel that already was entitled for multifamily housing, and now they don't have to go through the city process of saying we're going to build housing for homeless here because it's already entitled. So they don't get to decide what the design will be, but they get to go ahead and just build a project, and that's pretty powerful. So we're very aware of the fact that as architects, we are part of the privileged class, we're part of the professional class. Aesthetics and art are traditionally something that is associated with wealth. We look at architectural history and we're looking at chateaus. We're not looking at the houses that people built for themselves. So we have our preconceived notions about what is handsome, what is stylish, and so we try to recognize when we're entering into a community that maybe doesn't have the same socioeconomic background as ourselves. They may have a different aesthetic. They may not like what we like to look at, and how do we identify that? So in the world of art, this was a cool slide. These 4 levels of where is an architect in this world? And so I think we're probably, the next button, I think we're in the middle here. We're not high on the wealth scale. We'd like to think that we're the visionary artists, but we're also a consultant like the lawyer is, so we're not the tastemakers that we necessarily think we are. Next image. Although we definitely think we are. We were just talking about the architect's uniform before the show started. So at Piatak, we have 4 design principles that we try to bring to every project, and these are not project specific, and you can see they're not based on style or aesthetics either. And so through a community engagement process, we try to learn the history of that site. What can we do to reflect what happened on this site before we're building this project here? Who are the people in the neighborhood? Who are the people who are going to be living here? What are their traditions? So then for each project coming out of answering these questions, we might develop project-specific design guidelines that are really based more in aesthetics or based in form, but they're coming out of these core principles. Okay, so how do we learn that? And you'll see more slides on this later, we'll go back to that one. Thanks. Is the community engagement process. I mean, in the other slideshow presentations, you'll see more on that. But, you know, literally sitting down at a table with markers and with pieces of foam blocks and maps and saying, you know, what do you think you want in your neighborhood? And we want to build these houses. Where should they go? Or what is the right number? And to get people to posit their own design theories and share them and share why. That's important. And then we'll go back and digest that and try to interpret that and then present it back to the community. Say, this is what we heard. Did we hear you correctly? Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. Okay. So now I'm going to show you some of our affordable housing projects. So I'll show you some recently completed projects and then some work that's on the board. This is housing for formerly homeless. This is about 20 units on a very small little corner site in Oakland. And I love it. Okay. This one is in Phoenix. This is for Native American Connections. Very different, kind of a similar but different aesthetic that came out of that process. Really strong focus in this building on the climate. Having every unit is a townhouse with through ventilation, and there's a deep courtyard in the middle that's very shaded because it's so, I don't have to tell you, it's hot in Phoenix. So a different outcome that came through a different engagement process. This one is in a very suburban community. It's senior housing. This courtyard is looking out on a wide open space across the way. Low slung forms, you know, coming out, and traditional forms that fit with the politics of that neighborhood. This is down by San Diego. This was a two-phase project, and what came out of that project was that, yeah, the mission style was very important to that community. So, you know, we have to do our toned down, affordable, less costly version of mission style, but that was important here. Okay, next. So this project is under construction. This is a partnership with SRG in Seattle for the Seattle Housing Authority. We used to have an office in Seattle. And this is one phase of a master plan that is a redevelopment of a former public housing site. And we did a similar Hope 6 project in Oakland where there was very sketchy, very bad public housing and lots of land that was part of that. And the HUD's Hope 6 project wants mixed income development. In the end, it still all turned out to be low income development. But what happens with that kind of change is that the overall number of low income units goes down. And so we try to push for it to increase, if anything. And in fact, density really is probably the greenest sustainable measure that you could push for in a project. So if we have a client who comes and says, I think we could do 40 or 50 units on this parcel, we'll say, oh, I think we can fit 60. Here's what that would look like. What do you think? Okay. This project is also under construction. This is in Walnut Creek. This one is on the grounds of a church that was already providing homeless outreach services in their neighborhood. And they wanted to rebuild the little one-story building that they were providing the services out of. And they hired us to do some workshopping with them. And we said, well, what about housing too? So this is, they partnered with a nonprofit housing developer as well. Trinity Center is the church advocacy group. And it is housing upstairs for formerly homeless, and then on the ground floor is a day center where street homeless people can come and receive services and meet with housing navigators to help them find a permanent solution. Okay. Another important aspect of maintaining affordable housing is preservation of existing units. This is in San Francisco. This development, it's an existing development originally designed by SOM, and we're working with Mercy Housing to try to, it's falling apart in some places, and none of it's accessible, so We're bringing an elevator, accessibility, creating a little community building. This project is also on the boards. This is with the Native American Health Center, which will have a clinic on the ground floor, and then a nonprofit housing developer upstairs who will provide affordable housing and working with their tight budget also, but also trying to reflect some of the basket weaving traditions that are very important to coastal tribes in California. So that's in progress. This is in Santa Rosa. This project is going through full EIR because the neighbors have already said that they're going to sue us on the basis of it's in a historic district. And the historic district is a neighborhood of single-family homes, and we're drastically increasing the density. So this is a whole campus, a whole block with 3 buildings on it. This building will be built by Catholic Charities, and it is a family shelter because they're already providing a family shelter on that site, and a day center for drop-in street homeless to meet with housing navigators. There will be a clinic. There will be medical respite for homeless people who have been released from hospital but have nowhere to go to recuperate. We're going to have a kitchen, cafeteria, service providers, whole campus. Next slide. And then the other 2 buildings will be built by Burbank Housing, and that's affordable housing targeting formerly homeless and special needs folks. And because, you know, that building, there is also kind of a traditional mission vibe going on that street in particular. And so you saw inside courtyard shots where we could try to be a little more progressive with that interpretation, but the outside is more traditional. This is in Castro Valley. It backs up to a creek. On the other side of the creek is the Japanese Gardens. This was a Caltrans site. They bought this site and took down the old bungalow homes that were on it when they thought they were going to build a highway through it. So trying to reflect that kind of style back into the neighborhood. This is the first project I've worked on that actually had its own special election and ballot measure because the neighbors were that much up in arms about it. So this is a former Coast Guard barracks. We're going to renovate it and turn it into senior assisted living for formerly homeless seniors, and there will be a clinic and medical respite associated with it as well. There was a special election in April just for this project where, you know, don't vote for this homeless project or you'll get tents everywhere. Vote for zoning this as open space. This site that has an old rundown barracks on it should be open space. Fortunately, the city was very much in favor of our project, and the client is very organized in that community already. So it did pass, but not by a huge margin. Okay, this is very low density out on the coast in Moss Beach, going for kind of a sea ranchy type vibe. That came out of some of the public meetings where when the neighbors weren't yelling at us and telling us that they absolutely will move if this project gets built. You can see it's so terrible. It would be such a horrible detriment to their community. The client didn't like how the renderings were looking a little drab, so it's going to be a more colorful project. Even the sky got bluer on the coast. I don't know if you noticed that. Okay, this one is in West Oakland. It started out as family housing with childcare. Couldn't get funding for the childcare. It dropped 3 stories. And became just family housing, and now couldn't get that, family housing with veterans, couldn't get that funding, and now it's going to be formerly homeless. And so this neighborhood, they were just excited to see development on an empty parcel that was an eyesore in their neighborhood. They were very supportive of the project. They didn't have anything to say about the architecture. And so we got to express our, contemporary chops a little bit more. Okay. This is in Sonoma. This is the highest density project in the city of Sonoma by about 50%. We had a very involved community process where we had a community we had a little subcommittee made up of some neighbors, made up of some other folks, leaders in the town. We met with them 4 times. We talked about density and where the families are and where the noise is in the neighborhood, got the site plan dialed in just right. As for the architecture, they said, hey, you're the architects. We don't want to see another farmhouse style. We don't want to see another mission style. Like, give us something new. We're like, oh my God. That's exciting, but that's also really intimidating. New. So we tried to do this whole barn aesthetic, like a barn getting turned into kind of contemporary housing. Well, there was one planning commissioner who did not like that, and he's a historic preservationist. There were 2 planning commissioners who just hated us and were not going to vote yes, and there were 2 who loved us and were going to vote yes. So that one guy in the middle, he got to wag the dog, and here's what the project turned out looking like. So that was a disappointment for us, but a success for affordable housing. So that's it. That's what I have. Thank you.
Hello? Great. I have this theory that if I stand over here, the push button thing will work. All right. I'm Caroline Souza. I'm an associate and an architect at David Baker Architects. We're a firm also of about 40. We have offices in San Francisco, Oakland, and Birmingham, Alabama. I've been with David Baker Architects for 5 years. I am from an interesting generation of architects that graduated into the recession, and I spent a year living with my parents in Worcester, Ohio, unemployed, and building homes for Habitat for Humanity. So by the time I finally sweet-talked somebody into giving me a job, first in Chicago, later at David Baker in San Francisco, I already had that built-in focus on housing, focus on disadvantaged communities. So that's how I came to this specific aspect of the work. David Baker Architects is a multidisciplinary firm. A lot of our work is housing. About half of our housing work is affordable housing. Just double checking, everybody here has a pretty firm grasp on what I mean when I say affordable housing? Public subsidized? Great. So the Bay Area is a really interesting place to do housing because in 7 years, we added 722,000 jobs and only 106,000 homes. So we've got a big gap that we're dealing with. We have a big homeless housing crisis, but when recently the mayor of San Francisco proposed 200 beds in a temporary homeless shelter, she was shouted down at the neighborhood meeting, and in fact, the neighborhood raised $100,000 to oppose this, and then the Yimbys organized and got a competing fundraising campaign that raised $175,000 in support of it. So there's a lot of people who recognize that this is a problem and are really passionate about fixing it, and there are a lot of people who are saying, that's great, but I really don't want homeless folks right next to my fancy condo because I pay a lot for it, and, you know, I don't really want that out my front door. We were doing so well. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we have a lot of barriers to building affordable housing. Some of them are more technical in nature. Some of them are more social. But all of them require a combination of craftiness, using your architecture wiles, and also a sense of empathy and a real focus on not just building a building, but building the community. So starting with the crafty side, this was my first project at David Baker Architects. It is the largest affordable housing building at 200 units that's been built in 10 years. And one of the things that makes this possible is density. This project is very close to transit, and at 108 dwelling units per acre, we barely clear the Jane Jacobs standard for awesome urbanism? Maybe. I don't know. I don't know what she would think. We're close. One of the things that's great about this project is that because of the transit accessibility, we got away with 0.26 car spaces per unit and 1.26 bike spaces per unit. And since these days in San Francisco, it costs about 50 grand to build a covered parking space, this saved us a lot of money. It also saved us a lot of space so that our ground floor could house people instead of house cars. And then you get these great ground floor streetscapes with stoops where you can meet your neighbors. Again, being crafty, building community. We got to have great community serving retail, lobbies, and community space where the residents can start to gather, connect, meet each other. One of our design theories at David Baker Architect is the theory of a little bit goes a long way. So I flatter myself that this is a pretty cool facade, but if you look closely, only about 15% of it is premium materials. The rest is pretty much a stucco box with some doodads on it. We stacked all of the units. This project only had 3 unit types. It was amazing. So we definitely saved ourselves, at least ourselves, a lot of money and effort on just keeping it simple. And throughout the whole project, really focusing on keeping the units simple, straightforward, clean, and then spending our money where it really counted, in the public realm and in the common spaces in the project. So speaking of stacking units, we've been doing a lot of that lately. We've gotten into modular. What you're seeing here is our first constructed modular project. This is 243 units in the East Bay. This is market rate. Here's a photo of it in real life. It's not just a rendering, it really happened. And so, this is our first. We took some bumps and bruises. You can ask me about it later. But we feel like we're getting a handle on this now. And so we're very excited about this project Tipping Point, which is 145 formerly homeless units with Mercy Housing and Tipping Point. Homeless housing is great. For modular, it's a really good case because the units are very straightforward, they're very repetitive. Here you can see we've squeezed a lot of them into a pretty tight site. This actually has 405 dwelling units per acre, which is, I think, our densest project to date. And here you see, these are all the mate lines. So because it's all studios, it's just 1 unit per module. We run the modules across the corridor, so you don't have to build a corridor in a canyon once you stack the mods. We learned that one the hard way. But it works out really well, and so we think this is a strong case study for where modular really starts to make sense. Another interesting thing about this project is that Tipping Point's funding is private. It's through private donations, partially through the Housing Accelerator Fund, which allows us to sort of sidestep some of the more onerous local requirements for affordable housing, because affordable housing is often burdened with greater levels of compliance and sometimes whimsical interpretations of how things should be built. And so being able to get around that often is a substantial cost and time savings for projects. These 2 projects are both David Baker Architects projects. They're both micro units. They both have ground floor retail. The one on the left is condos, where a studio is sold for about $500,000. The one on the right is formerly homeless housing. And really the main difference is that the formerly homeless housing comes with a bunch of supportive services and systems for integrating the residents into the community, which is really important in all of our projects. So what you're going to see next is a sort of tour of our community engagement and also how we start to design our spaces to support communities. We've started doing very, very early community engagement on some of our projects, what we're calling phase 0. This is the site for someday 60 units of affordable housing with one of our favorite clients, Ibaltsi. They're very connected to the West Oakland neighborhood. But, that's a few years out. Right now, we are starting with phase 0. So our first act was that we put up this sign which says, "What do you want to see here?" And we kind of kicked it off with some markers to have people start writing, but in this neighborhood with a lot of graffiti culture, it kind of took off. And so this was how we did passive community engagement, just to get a sense of what was going on. Phase 0.5 is a temporary market pop-up place called Sparkit Place. Ibalsi happens to have a mission that focuses on community engagement and raising up local entrepreneurs and small businesses. So this was a marketplace that happens about once a month. They've worked with these entrepreneurs for years now, and eventually they graduate into Ibalsi's neighborhood serving retail. In the meantime, it's a great spot for us to do community engagement on the building, which will eventually be there. As we do community engagement, one of our favorite and most labor-intensive ways of doing it is table exercises. So we get groups of people together and we come up with these games, often they're models. Here's an example from a 15-acre master planning exercise that we're in the middle of right now. So you give them kind of a preset group of pieces and some rules, and then work with the community members to deploy these pieces in a way that feels appropriate to them. And on this project, we had 9 tables, and they all look something like this, which on this slide is kind of an unintelligible mess. We started to simplify it, break it down a little bit, analyze it, and we started to see trends appearing, like here's a great spot to connect to that street. Or, wow, that's a lot of parks, but if we stack them up, it becomes pretty obvious that the big park goes in the upper right-hand corner, and the small park goes in the middle. Another growing focus in our firm is on resilience, community resilience. Often, historically disenfranchised communities have some pretty big environmental issues, sea level rise, heat, air quality. So in all of our projects, we need to start bringing that into the calculus of what it is that we build. This is a project in Charleston. It is replacing a senior community that was there that the building was destroyed in a hurricane. So this new project, the ground floor is actually designed to flood. There's not a whole lot of program, just some parking and a space with nothing in it that they use for parties. But then upstairs, we built on the local porch culture, and each unit gets a rocking chair on this large shared porch where everybody hangs out. So this is a way of building that community resilience, that social resilience that helps people recover from the bad things that happen to buildings and to communities. The Bay Area doesn't necessarily have a porch culture, but we've worked a lot on integrating our community spaces together in order to promote interaction. So in this project, you can see that there's a play area, a community garden, a patio for hanging out, a community room, and a laundry all together. So you can imagine that dad's doing laundry and he's kind of keeping an eye on the kids who are running around crawling on the gorilla while maybe mom or grandma is working on their favorite vegetable plot. And all of this, all these interactions that happen are part of what make the social fabric of the project successful. Yep. Haha. And then it's good to have fun, and also if you have a premium view, that's a great spot for some community space, just prioritizing the community space as a key part of the building. After the building is done, our work is not. This is a pro bono project that we did with this woman named Beanie. She's a graduate of the, oh goodness, I just forgot, of a accelerator for small women, minority-owned businesses, restaurant businesses. And so we've been working with her for years. She was originally supposed to go into one of our projects that kind of fell through. So we picked ourselves up and we actually put it in another affordable housing project by Owen Kennerly, great building. And you know, she just has such an amazing story. She's an immigrant. She's a survivor of spousal abuse. But she's started this business. She makes delicious, delicious momos. And we're just really excited to see her restaurant up and running now. Another initiative we've been working on recently is learning from our projects. We've been going back to built work and asking, how did it go? So far, the most successful one has been this photo where we're at the food bank. That's the only chance we get to have people sit down and pay attention for long enough to fill out our questionnaire. But we've learned all kinds of important things like don't put carpet in your corridors because the kids take out the garbage, but they're too short, so they drag the garbage along the floor and leave a slime trail. So it's things like this that you just never really know until you go back and you tour the building, you talk to the residents, you figure out what's working and what's not. And then we take all this great knowledge and we share it. This is a picture of ELPN, which is an organization I'm a part of, where affordable housing developers, property managers, architects, engineers, lawyers, financiers, mostly young folks, collaborate, present to each other, and help everybody skill up. Here we are learning about how to do performas. You can see there are a lot of spreadsheets, and these guys are all nerds, and they're very excited about it. Another key thing to do to support great affordable housing is to throw parties. How else do you expect to meet each other, right? That's what we're doing here. This is kind of a dry party. It's true. But, you know, this is a chance where you all get to connect. You get to learn from each other. You get to talk to that planner and ask them what the heck is going on with those streetlights in that neighborhood. This is your opportunity. So take this opportunity and make more of them. Go to the happy hours, meet people, throw parties. And finally, I just wanted to end with why we do this. This is LaTanya Williams. Before she got a spot in an affordable housing project, she was addicted to drugs. She was a sex worker. She lost custody of her son. She got a spot in a housing project. The social workers and the whole team worked with her, and she got clean. She regained custody of her son. She went to college. She was the valedictorian at community college. And then she went to graduate school and got a degree as a social worker. She has her master's degree. And she likes to say, I used to be a hopeless dope fiend, and now, I'm going to mess this up. And now I'm a dopeless hope fiend. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Those were two really interesting presentations, and you're going to see a lot of similarities, I can guarantee you. Angie Brooks, principal of Brooks plus Scarpa Architects. My first job out of architecture school was actually working for a nonprofit developer called the LA Community Design Center, because I really wanted to make cities better. I didn't want to work in a traditional architecture firm. So I did that for 3 years. And so I come from the nonprofit development world, but I'm also, at my core, an architect and a designer. So I like to say I'm a frustrated urban planner. We've always believed that access to housing and good design should be a right and not a privilege. So our firm continually proactively works with nonprofits that provide 100% affordable housing. Like this build project that, if you saw Larry's talk when he was here, was finished almost 20 years ago in Santa Monica, and it was a demonstration project for them. What we realized is that cities don't like risk, and so if you want to do something that is something they've never done before, you just call it a demonstration project, and then they're okay with it. I'm not kidding. So it was 20 years ago, so it was supposed to be a green project. No one knew what that meant. So we basically came up with a list of features to do things like, it's actually designed to be energy neutral. So it has both solar and a microturbine on it. We did a lot of other things, but the reason why I'm showing it is because a lot of the things that we did back then are now code in the city of Santa Monica. So this was a demonstration project for them, which proved a lot of the theories that they had. City of Santa Monica, for instance, in the alley, did a whole stormwater retention system that took all the stormwater from the entire block, not just our project. And we put some money into it because we had to do a small retention system. They paid the rest. Year later, every single development in Santa Monica had to be 100% stormwater mitigation. So this is where practice informs policy. Unfortunately, more and more cannot afford housing. It used to be that if you worked, you could get ahead, but now we have what we call the working poor, and housing is getting more and more out of reach. Some of the statistics are just kind of amazing to me. In 2010, almost 15% of Americans were living below the poverty line. In 2017, in Los Angeles, the average monthly rent for an apartment was over $2,000, which is 2/3 higher than the national average. And in Los Angeles, that eats up more than 50% of the local median household income for us. So affordable housing is generally defined as 30% of your income is spent on housing. So if you're over 50%, it's not affordable for you because you don't have money to do other things like buy food, childcare, things like that. So along with our affordability crisis everywhere in this country, we also have a climate crisis. But in California, we're lucky to have our governor. Arnold Schwarzenegger actually served as our governor from 2003 to 2011, and I think a policy which is called AB 32 is really going to be his legacy. This is our long-term approach to addressing climate change in California. A lot of these codes that have changed over time came out of AB 32, but we've had Title 24 since the 70s, and that's an energy code that we have that's more stringent than the rest of the country, and it's the main reason our per capita electricity use has remained flat over the last 40 years while the rest of the country has continued to rise. But Schwarzenegger knew that that wasn't enough, so he signed this bill, AB 32, which was meant to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020. California actually met these targets in 2016, which was 4 years ahead of schedule. So they said, well, we did it so easily and quickly, let's do SB 32. That is a state requirement to more than double the current rate by 2030. And that really takes political leadership. We now have something also, if you may have heard about it, called SB 50, you can turn, which is another bill to increase density in all zones around California, including the R1 single-family home areas, and it's very controversial. It's been watered down a little bit, but I think it's going to pass, and that's a really great thing, too. You'll notice that I have density on all of my slides. I always do, because I think it's really important. And funding for affordable housing requires a much higher level of performance on the energy side. So I'm going to show a few projects that are done for local nonprofits. This one's called Step Up on Second. It's for previously homeless people who have mental disabilities. And our strategy here was to increase the density as much as possible. The client actually said, put as many units on this site as you can, maximizing the type 5 wood frame construction, and a very sustainable building. So it had to be a passive building. And the density is almost as high as Manhattan in a 5-story type 5 building. And the strategy was really to do a passive building. So if you look at the footprint of this building, it's the letter E. It has 2 small courtyards in it so that all the units get natural light and cross ventilation. And it's really how we used to do buildings 100 years ago before we had air conditioning. They were called alphabet buildings, and they had courtyards within them. The fins on the front of the building diffuse the early morning light, and this 4-story screen here that's on the south side was really a design element to kind of enclose the courtyards, but what we didn't realize was that it was also going to decrease our energy use. So it shaded the building and decreased our energy load by about 10%. There are social spaces on every other floor. Each unit has a mini kitchen, and then there are big kind of communal kitchens on every other floor. Basically, we wanted to make this like a big house for the 46 people that live here. And it's an example of what Santa Monica had at the time on the books as good parking policy, which is 0.25 spaces per unit. At the time, they also required guest parking, so I won't get into it, but we had to build a subterranean garage that no one parks in at the cost of almost $3 million. We could have built a whole nother project for that. And because he got tax credits, he cannot lease those spaces to anyone else. So parking costs a lot of money, and if we don't pay for parking, we can pay for a lot of other stuff. The state of California now allows, if we were to do this project now, 0.3 spaces per unit, unless you're near transit, and then you can have 0 spaces near transit. This project is in Venice, where I live, for another nonprofit called the Venice Community Housing Corp. So even though the state provides incentives above local zoning, it still takes us a long time to get projects approved. But as Teresa said, we really believe that it's cheaper to house people and provide support for the homeless. Fast Company actually had an article a year ago that looked at this, and they discovered that leaving a homeless person on the streets cost Los Angeles an average of $35,000 per year in medical, emergency, mental health services, and law enforcement. If you then incarcerate that person, the cost goes up to $46,000 per year. So at an investment of $10,000, you can actually help that same person obtain housing, food, job training, and support services. So some of the nonprofits that we work with have job training facilities within their organizations where they actually train people for jobs, and this is considered a step up for them. They live here and then they move on to more permanent housing in other neighborhoods or bigger units or family apartments. In Los Angeles, we also have a lack of supply. So we're not building as much as you guys are in Northern California. Our vacancy rate has remained among the lowest nationally. Our vacancy rate was 3% in 2017, and it has remained unchanged since 2012. And I sort of can see that our vacancy rate, we haven't built any housing, and our homeless problem has really increased. So I can see the links between the fact that we're not building anything and we have a huge homeless problem. There's something on the order of 54,000 homeless people in Los Angeles alone. So the voters in Los Angeles in 2016 approved a few ballot measures, and it was by a landslide, 70% of voters, to fund housing and support services for the homeless. We also voted to tax ourselves. We voted to raise our sales tax by 0.5 cent to expand public transit. We have several other policies. In 2015, we have something called AB 744, and that was to amend the state density bonus ordinance, which locally will prevent local jurisdictions from imposing higher parking requirements, and that was something that was happening. It allows less parking near transit, higher densities. You can have 100% affordable housing or a mix of housing, and it's ministerial, so you don't have to wait for all of your entitlements. In 2017, the voters approved Measure JJJ, and this is also called transit-oriented communities, and this is something a lot of developers are using now because it's essentially by right. They have different tiers, 4 different tiers, but if you're really close to transit, you can have 0 parking. And if the developer wants to provide more parking, they can, but most nonprofit developers don't because they don't need it, and if they need a few car spaces, they will provide it. We also have Measure HHH, and I want to tell Teresa that this is bigger than yours. So it's $1.2 billion bond to build approximately 10,000 units of supportive housing done by the City of Los Angeles, and it's a loan program. This project is also being used as an example of what a solution could look like. This is for homeless veterans for the Skid Row Housing Trust, and it was their first project off of Skid Row. It's called the 6, and it's another passive building. Most of our buildings are courtyard buildings. We start with the courtyard because that's what you need to do for both kind of this internal social space that people really want, that they circulate through, and then also to make it a passive building where every unit can get light and ventilation. But I think actually the social spaces that come from a courtyard are what make it really successful. This project has 22 cars for 52 units. The courtyard's on the 2nd floor. This is a big rec room here. This is a computer lab down here. And we met with the building committee that was made up of homeless people who were previously homeless, and we had a big monumental stair connecting this courtyard to the street, And the people who were previously homeless said, Angie, we lived on the street. We don't want to be that connected to the street anymore. We have a place to live. So the courtyard, actually, if you're sitting here, there's no guardrail. This is just a stepped planter. You can actually see the street. So you have this visual connection to the street, but not a physical connection to it. And that's what people really wanted. So we actually changed our design through that process. But we did a few other things, like prefab walls and floors. We're continually trying to make things less expensive and quicker. But construction time was longer on this project because we did a lot of design build and prefab stuff. So we're utilizing prefab modular construction on a new idea, which is this one. And we were really honored to win a $1 million grant from Los Angeles County about 6 months ago. They asked architects and developers, and really anyone, what can we do to solve our homeless problem? And so our idea was to use the prefab modular home building process and tailor it to the permanent supportive housing model. Our team members are Plant Prefab and Community Corporation of Santa Monica, because we realized a lot of the elements that we continually design in this housing are repetitive. They're the same. The units are generally the same. And so that could be adapted really easily to the prefab modular unit. We also believe that homelessness is reversible. I don't think it's a permanent condition. We just need the will to do it. So we called this the Nest Design Toolkit, and it's scalable and adaptable on any combination of typical lots in LA County, and it can be used by any developer and architect team. Most of the lots in LA started out as 50 by 100 foot suburban lots, and you tie them together and you have 100 by 100 or what have you. So we started with the smallest lot, which is 100 by 50, and the modules will fit on that size lot with the setbacks that are required. This is what it looks like stacked on a more urban lot to the maximum height, which is 5 stories. So it also works on smaller lots at 1 story. Any combination of lots really works. And the modules range from traditional bed type to more individualized spaces with bathrooms and kitchens. And there are 3 different kinds, and we titled them after the nesting habits of birds. So if you know anything about birds, this is the blue jay, and it's temporary living for temporary living situations. This is the dove, which is a little bit more permanent, and it includes sleeping areas and bathrooms only, and then shared spaces. So there are shared kitchens and shared showers. And then the osprey is the most permanent type, which is individualized units, so studios, 2 bedrooms, or 3 bedrooms. And then these are the shared spaces. Every module is exactly the same size. It's about 11.5 feet by 28 feet for ease of transport and stackability. And all of the units are able to be combined in different ways to create larger rooms or to be organized on a site in different ways. These are the components. We're designing also exterior facades that could be added on site depending on the scale of project, the neighborhood, the orientation, or the preference. And these are just some examples of what it might look like. It allows you to tailor the look of the building as needed, and it's really meant to be a long-term solution that can be replicated throughout Los Angeles. And so this project, we received the $1 million grant, but with that grant, we actually have to do something. So we looked at 2 different sites. One of them fell through. This is actually a site that is on top of an existing church parking lot. 20% of California community colleges students are homeless. A much higher percentage of students who go to our California community colleges actually have food insecurity and housing insecurity, so it's a huge problem. There's a church in Santa Monica that realized this issue, and Santa Monica College is directly across the street, so they actually provided temporary housing within their church for these students. So this is their parking lot, and we're planning on doing more permanent housing for students above their parking lot. It's designed to be basically a big house sitting on columns above the parking lot. Each module is a bedroom here. And it's for these homeless students. Part of it will be site-built This stuff will be site-built, but everything that sits up here will be the modules. And it happens to be a corner site. This is a more commercial boulevard, and this is a neighborhood street. So this is actually zoned R1. It's zoned R1 single family. So we're utilizing the state law, the ADU state law that California has for accessory dwelling units. You're allowed to attach that to your main house so that it looks like one building, but it allows you to have 2 kitchens. So the problem that we've always had is having more kitchens in the R1 neighborhood. So you have 2 kitchens, and we have 13 bedrooms because we have 13 modules, and we can have up to 16 people here with 1 exit. So it's meant to be a big house, 13 bedrooms, and we're doing it by right in the R1 neighborhood. So what we're trying to do really with this toolkit is provide innovation maybe at a smaller scale, but I really think we need innovation at all levels and all scales, including financing. The financing part of this is sometimes really ridiculous, and it costs a lot of money, and it takes a long time. But I really believe that our profession, architects and urban designers, are the best people to actually tackle these problems and solve these issues on both the design level and the policy level. So I'm happy to be here, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank y'all for coming. Thank y'all for coming. Appreciate y'all being here. So some of the things we talked about previously were density, and I really want to talk more about how y'all deal with density. Sometimes we have a lot of pushback here and in some other cities and other states as far as how density works, and we should all live on half-acre lots or quarter-acre lots or whatever it is, right? And there should only be one house. So I would like y'all to talk a little bit about how that density works, but mostly I think in maybe more like in the Bay Area, you probably have less of an issue with that because you have so many, yeah, right? So it's a little iffy, right? So because it's probably a little easier for density.
It really depends on the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say that it's relative because, our towns are denser, but the affordable housing projects are usually denser than the average density that's existing in that town, right? And in order to get kind of economies of scale with construction, and also just to try to maximize the use of whatever land is available for affordable housing. So we are, I mean, I don't think I've ever had a project where we were not asking for a higher density than what the zoning allowed.
Right.
Yeah.
And some of the things we talked about previously were, so the kinds of projects that are dense and less dense, so like projects that have only 60, 80 units versus projects that have maybe like 300 units, and what does that mean to a community, and what does that mean to the actual housing community? So I guess what I'm after there is, what are you seeing for consequences for how it affects neighbors, particularly those in low income and neglected neighborhoods? And I know that you deal with a lot of the community engagement for other neighborhoods, but I assume that we are looking at a lot of we have neglected neighborhoods. You don't necessarily call them that, but these lower income neighborhoods.
Yeah, to me, density has to go with other things. So you can't have a suburban neighborhood that doesn't have any transit and just build a dense project there. So it's kind of educating people on the links between density and transit and other services. And in Los Angeles, what transportation people did was build transit in areas where nobody would complain about it. So we have the Blue Line, which is going to Long Beach from downtown LA, that goes directly through industrial areas because there were no people living near there. And so Livable Places was a nonprofit that I founded several years ago, and the first study we did was how many people are living within a quarter mile of each transit stop on this light rail that they have already built, and it was 0, maybe 2 people. We went back to the city of Long Beach and we said, hey, you need to redevelop this area because there are no people living next to the transit. And they said, well, those numbers have to be wrong. And we had gotten the data from them. So we said, we got our information from you guys. So we did our first project near a transit stop in an industrial area, and they were just going to change the zone for us to allow housing to be built there because it's illegal to build housing in the industrial area. in Long Beach. Once we did our project, they rezoned the entire boulevard and priced us out of the neighborhood. So we were actually going to do something else because the land was really cheap because it was industrial. But when you educate people on the links between support services and transit and density, you really need to build density near transit. And so that's kind of how we try to sell the project. And if you're in LA, if you live anywhere in LA, you're near bus lines, you're near transit. So part of our problem is it was a big suburb that was developed, and then the transit went on top of it. So now we have people in single-family homes living right next to a transit stop, and people can build denser there, and they don't want the density near them. So I think part of it is an educational thing that you have to do, and then part of it is also infrastructure. You have to convince people that the infrastructure is going to be there when you're going to be building this 5-story building. Those are two things.
Yeah, I think you really tackled the neighborhood infrastructure that goes with density. In terms of managing the community and really reaching out to them and making that work, one common tactic is that with those board games that I showed you, we only give them the pieces that are the number of units that we want, and we say, okay, here's all the pieces that we need to fit on the site. You figure out how you want this to work, and they quickly come to the conclusion that we can't do this all with single-family homes. We just can't get the units that we need to get. And so that's one way to make it really obvious, like, oh, okay, here's how many we have to build, and then they can start to talk about where they want the density. Do they want it on this side? Do they want it close to the street, far from the street? The other thing, two other tactics. One is that we show them non-scary pictures of dense things. Like, people love Paris. Paris is really dense. Not that every neighborhood should be Paris dense, but that's one that we show people. And then finally, we spend a lot of time wrapping things in townhouses or other smaller, shorter things. So pay no attention to the 5-story building that's back there. There's a cute townhouse up front, and that actually works remarkably well.
So then I want to move on to affordable housing and development, because you mentioned several of your clients during your talks. And then who's involved in that? And I also want to talk a little bit about tax credits and how that kind of thing works. How are these things funded?
Well, tax credits, which are federally allocated, and each state has their own allocation committee that then evaluates applicant projects to figure out who to give the tax credits to, right? I don't know if I'm going too deep into it.
Yeah.
But to leverage the tax credits, because it's not going to pay for your own project, you have to have upfront money, and that's how you compete. The projects that have more upfront money, probably from their jurisdiction, are going to be more competitive.
Yeah, I think what I'm really more after there is to say who's interested in developing this housing? I mean, who are these people? Why are they developing affordable housing? So part of it's interest, and then part of it is what's in it for them. You know what I'm saying?
Well, okay, so most of my clients are a nonprofit affordable housing developer. So their mission is to do this, right? So that's why they want to. They were probably founded, I'll say, for Allied Housing, which is the subsidiary of Abode Services that does housing development. That started out as a small group of people, and they were not federally qualified to apply for tax credits. So what they would do is they would get control of a piece of land. They would envision a project and get control of the land, and then go to a larger developer and say, hey, partner with us on this. And after enough partnerships, then they became qualified to apply for tax credits on their own. Through the tax credit program, the developer can also get a developer fee out of the, all the things that they pay for the land, they pay for the architects, they pay for the construction, and they also have to pay for their own time, so they get a developer fee. And there's a limit on how much their developer fee can be. And that kind of puts a limit on how big the projects are, also makes it financially infeasible for them. But that's how they pay for, their staff time or for having money to hold land.
Right, and so when we're talking about these projects too, though, we have case management, social, some sort of social network inside of the buildings, right?
Yes.
It's not just normal apartment living like most of us lived when we were in college or how we live now, but it's a little bit different atmosphere, right?
Yes.
And so you're designing that into the spaces as well, or the buildings.
Yes, depending, I mean, you want to talk about
PSH, permanent supportive housing. Yeah, and so the money, some of the money is earmarked for this by itself. So you have to provide the supportive services. And what we're finding is the nonprofits that we've been working with, some of them traditionally don't do permanent supportive housing. They just do affordable housing, and they're learning how to do the permanent supportive housing piece of it because that's where the money is right now.
Yeah, and the, like all of the projects probably have a service provider's office in it, and the permanent supportive housing will have more because they'll have case managers also. But the services themselves, like the actual case manager's time over the years, is not funded through the affordable housing dollars. It'll get funded through social services dollars. We did one project in Fremont where they actually did factor in money for the for a fund for long-term provision of services because service dollars are at risk every year. They apply every year to the city, like give me money to provide services to homeless people, and maybe they'll get it, maybe it'll go to somebody else, and maybe the city will change their budget. So that part's very much at risk with affordable housing as a services.
So just to give you a sense of the scale of the different pieces of funding, one of the projects I'm working on right now has the unfortunate distinction of being the most expensive affordable housing built in San Francisco. But that project, 40% of the funding came from the city, so the mayor's office of housing. 40% came from tax credits, which are federal tax credits, but they're managed at the state level. And then 9% came from ASIC funding, which I'm 90% sure is also state managed. And then 5% was from debt. And then there's some other little bits and pieces. And one thing to keep in mind is that every level of this funding comes with strings attached. So as an architect, navigating the various strings attached to all the different money can be a real adventure.
Very complicated. They all have their own sustainability lists. And so I've been to TCAC seminars because I've been invited by my client, and I say, hey, can you guys all get on the same page and please ask us just to do the same thing? Because whether I have no VOC paint or low VOC paint, who the heck cares? At the end of the day, it's going to be, you know, a net zero building anyway. So, you know,
Pick
hopefully that they'll figure all that out, but it is very complicated when you have more than one funding source.
The people who develop projects are really, really bright. Figuring all this out is no small task.
So you all talked about homeless, transitioning, and that kind of thing. I'm thinking about here we have our median household income in Clark County is $57,000 and change. So that's where we are median-wise. Owner-occupied housing in 2017 was 54%. The national average is 63%, almost 64%. And then median property values here in 2017 were also $250,000, which is about $30-some-odd thousand more than the national average. So what I'm thinking about here is, you know, when we're talking about affordable housing, sometimes we're also talking about people that are in that that median income range and also a little bit above that. So like Nevada Hand here builds for about the 60% range, and I'm wondering like where these projects are falling. Some of the projects that you do, I think, are a little bit higher for income, and some are lower, yeah. And what the differences in those are.
Yeah, low income, I think, is generally like 60% of median income. And then like supportive housing is maybe 30% or less, maybe zero. And then moderate would be like 80 to 120%. And I haven't worked on moderate income. I've worked on market rate, which doesn't have any subsidy or any kind of rental controls.
We do the full range. Recently, folks have been having a hard time making moderate pencil just because of construction costs. There are fewer subsidies. They're all a little different. The populations are different, so moderate income tends to have less social services, so infrastructure, things like that. But maybe there's lots of families, and so there's after-school programming. Each group has kind of a different basket of needs, and so the spaces vary.
We have done a lot of very low income and low income, mainly because the subsidies or the developers are doing that. But we have right now a private client who wants to do 10% moderate income, because for him in downtown LA, moderate income in the Flower District is really important to him. But it's kind of from the coming from the private side and not the nonprofit side. But I think that that's a big segment of the population that's missing, which is what people call workforce housing. And we did some of that a long time ago, but not now. We have such a huge homeless problem that everyone is concentrating on the fact that people are living outside on the streets, and we need to solve that first.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the median income level people are really like near homeless is what I would call them, since they're borderline, like when, it's kind of like, if I have to pay $50 for rent another month, I'm going to lose the whole thing.
Yeah, so the City of LA has never done a really good study on that, but part of my master's thesis is about this, so I know about this. Our 3 mayors back, he did a study on how many people were living in garages, because we have a lot of people who are not living in what you would consider legal housing units. And they did a study, and they found about 40,000 people, and this was in the 90s, I think, early 90s, 40,000 people living in garages. And so what to do about that? They were supposed to then say, okay, we have people living in garages, let's change the zoning, reduce figure out, after spending all this money and doing this study, they said, as long as the garage is built up to current code and you guys provide the parking, you can live in your garage. So it was ridiculous. It didn't mean anything, so they kind of put that away. 10 years later, the next mayor wanted to do the same thing, hired a bunch of people. People are living in attics of houses. We have 3 families to a 1-bedroom house in Cudahy. I mean, it's a huge problem. No one's ever done anything about it. So the political will has never been there, but you'll hear stories about at Christmas time, Christmas tree catching on fire and all these people dying because they're living in these illegal units. And I estimate that we have 500,000 people in LA living in illegal units. So like you said, they're very close to being homeless, but they're not homeless yet. And so that's another problem that
Right, and
we have to solve.
That's who we need to figure out how to help, right?
Right.
So I want to open it up to maybe some questions that you all might have. I just wanted to touch on a few things to kind of get that going. So you would think about if you have funding questions, or even, well, they talked a lot about space and social spaces, which I thought was really important. I'm a big fan of courtyards for that. So anyone want to?
Do you have any possible projects in Las Vegas area coming up?
We would really enjoy that, but no.
Okay.
Thank you. All 3 of you touched on a topic that I'm not at all familiar with here, and it's something called formerly homeless housing. I'm involved with affordable housing, but I'm wondering how that works, and who are these formerly homeless residents? How do you choose them, and how do they pay rent? I mean, if you're making affordable housing, which is 30% of median income, how do these people pay that? Or is this all subsidized housing?
Okay. So affordable housing is defined as 30% of your income or less. And the balance of that is made up by a subsidy of some kind. And that's essentially the formula for affordable housing. So for individuals who have been homeless, they may be eligible for Social Security, for disability. And so that would probably be the basis of their income, and it would probably be less than 30% of area median income. So they would qualify for supportive housing, and they would pay up to 30% of their income. Their income might be zero, and so they would pay zero. And in fact, the housing provider will have a case manager then who would be working very hard to hook them up with meals provisions and donations for household goods and things like that, I guess is what I would say. A significant part of funding for supportive housing often is through HUD subsidies, like Section 8 subsidies, that individuals might have a Section 8 voucher, or the Housing Authority may assign project-based vouchers to a development.
So these must be like 202 funding that they start off with so that they can get subsidized residents.
So it's not just the HUD projects. The tax credit is providing financing for the life of the project, which is, I think, 15 year. I think it's done in 15-year segments. So it's providing ongoing income to the project so that covers all the operational needs, in addition to the small amounts of rent that are coming in from the tenants themselves.
And to answer the second half of your question, which is how they wind up in the housing, they're usually referred from the city, so that whatever social services agency is managing homeless outreach has a pool of potential candidates, and then there's some sort of lottery that happens. And often it's hundreds of people, applicants per unit, sometimes thousands.
And there's like a list, a coordinated network of information called HMIS. I think it's Homeless Management Information System, something. And so then there's a coordinated across different providers, a system for getting the folks who have the highest need into the supportive housing units.
And then there are different categories of homeless people. There are homeless veterans, and so some money is earmarked for specific categories of homeless people. There are also what they call TAY, T-A-Y, which is transitional aged youth, who are going out of the foster care system but do not have a support network. And I think it's something like 20% of the homeless in LA are these TAY kids. So they're between the ages of 18 and 24, and they're homeless. And so to get these kids at that age, to help them actually just give them a place to live so they can then kind of get a job, go to college or whatever, is really important and a big bang for the buck as far as I'm concerned. So one of the projects that we're working on right now is half of the units are set aside for adult homeless people and half are set aside for TAY. And then TAY it comes through a social service provider who actually, I'm not sure what their name is, but they actually only work with TAY youth.
And the VA has been a big leader in recent efforts to end chronic homelessness. They created their own voucher system, like the Section 8 voucher system. I don't know, it's called VASH. I don't know what the letters stand for. And so those are project-based vouchers, so that a particular project will have 15 units that they will house a chronically homeless veteran in. And I think there are a few states now where the VA has, they call effectively ended chronic homelessness among veterans. Not that it won't occur that someone would become homeless, but that there is a unit for them to move into quickly.
Las Vegas is one of those.
Yeah. Functional zero, that's right.
And we do have similar kinds of programs here. We follow all of those same paths here in the Valley. It's just that we don't have enough. I think that's the same with everywhere, is we just don't have enough of any of that. So it's hard for us to place families, women with children, men with children. It's really, really hard to place single men. And so these are all of your formerly homeless people, or they're currently homeless trying to become formerly homeless. And then what do you do with them? So there have been some other solutions like group home type of situations, but that has a kind of a negative connotation. And just like trying to find a space anywhere. We've been working locally on, something called a Landlord Liaison Project in the Joint Housing Committee. So we've been working on that for maybe 10 or 11 months. And it's making a little bit of progress. So we're, I hope that's going to come out in the next year or so. But we're trying to do what do you call it, master leasing with local landlords, and seeing if we can get them to agree on certain conditions to get actual homeless people into housing. Because a lot of them, like we mentioned earlier about the near homeless situation, is they're near homeless and then suddenly they become homeless. So it's not like maybe they have a job, but they may be in programs like Salvation Army has and I think Rescue Mission also has a similar one where you can, if you're working and you need a place to stay, but you can't afford an apartment. So there's always some other circumstances that put you in that situation. I got a question back here for you ladies.
Hi, I had I was fortunate to be able to attend the mayor symposium back in February, I believe, where it was, there was a number of speakers, including Larry Scarpa, I believe, and density was reiterated there as well as being very important. And working in housing for the state, I'm very familiar with all these funding sources, and that's generally, I grasp that. I understand the problem. My question is, and I can't remember who exactly said it, was that, if you have certain zoning that allows density up to however many units per acre, and then you might have a bonus, but there's other restrictions such as, setback requirements, all these other design elements other than what it says in a piece of paper that restricts it. So I think somebody anecdotally mentioned, they had a developer came and say, this zoning allows us 50 units an acre. Well, the architect's like, nah, that's what it says, but actually this is what you're going to get. So in California, I know that's a concern here, but is it similar in California? And is there other ways that you guys have looked to?
That was
try to
Larry
go?
who said that.
Oh, was it Larry? Okay. I didn't want to ascribe words if I was.
Because we have, yeah, and there's, Los Angeles hasn't changed its zoning since 1940, so it's just kind of crazy, but you can literally have a parcel where it'll say you can put 30 units on it. For instance, 50 by 100 foot size parcel, and we'll look at it, and if you look at the code that says you have to park 2 spaces per unit, and you have to get 100 cars in it, you have to build a 4-story garage underneath this parcel to actually get the number of units that the code allows you, that code says you can have. No one would ever do that in their right mind. So we quickly, we had one, I think it was 25 units, the code said he could put on his property. We put 5 condos in a row with 1 level of semi-subterranean parking, because anything above 5 would have meant we had to go down another level of parking. And car spaces are $30,000 a space minimum. And the deeper you go, the more expensive it gets. And if you're on a really small lot, 50 by 100, and you put a ramp in there, sometimes you can't even park it at all. So the code didn't make any sense and didn't have anything to do with reality. And part of it is zoning. I mean, it's a framework within which we build. And so cities need to have proper zoning for us to be able to design within it.
Yeah. And I will say that the state density bonus law there's more to it than just the density. It also comes with 3 waivers from development standards, so like setback or height. And then there's also language in there about and other additional concessions, that allow for financial feasibility of the project. And some cities have been very aggressive in how they interpret that. Like Oakland has said, the concessions are unlimited as long as the project can demonstrate that financial feasibility isn't possible without that concession. So there's a little more to the density bonus law, which is a great tool, and then some cities are being even more helpful.
So continuing my theme of knowledge sharing, I would say when you run into sites where they have constraints like that, store them up, gather a couple, and then go talk to your planning department, to whoever you can get to listen, the mayor, the city council person. My boss definitely grabs the mayor occasionally, and this is really not working. And actually, we've affected change. So, your architects, theoretically, we all know what we're talking about, right? And we are the ones who actually get to test this out and see if it'll work. So be a citizen architect, go out and participate in the process.
This is just one little story. continuing on what I said about LA building transit everywhere, they built what's called the Orange Line through R1 kind of neighborhoods, but they said, but along the Orange Line, they had rezoned C zoned. So that's fine, well and good. You can have C, you can have mixed use. Theoretically, you would want to build maybe 5 stories there or what have you. The only problem is they also have another code that said that if you are building in the C zone and you're next to the R1 zone, you can only build 25 feet. If you're 50 feet away from R1, you can build 35 feet. They had this tiering of heights, and I asked a planner, I said, do you know how many parcels in your city are within 50 feet, R1, within 50 feet of C, right, which would limit all of your C zones? And they said, no, we have no idea. There's no program that says how many parcels. So I said, well, I drew a little sketch of what the building would look like, and they were amazed that this was why they were asking me, why aren't people developing in this zone? And I had to prove with a sketch, this is the problem. It's your tiering of heights and the fact that you have R1 right next to C, right next to your orange line.
So I know you can't do this with the community engagement part. Are you doing design bid build? Are you doing design build with your projects? How are you accomplishing these things with your developers?
The affordable housing projects are usually a negotiated bid with a pre-qualified developer who probably provided pre-construction services during design.
But we're doing, with this innovation grant that we just won, because that was through LA County, LA City now, after watching LA County do it, it was so successful, LA City said, oh, we want innovation too. So they came out with, there are like 6 requests for proposals. Most of the ones that we've seen are developer-led, but we're on the team as well. And so they want innovation, and I lost my train of thought. What were we?
Design bid build?
Design bid build. So we're going out for another one. Next week we have our interview. And so we are doing design build, but it's kind of a hybrid because we're using the prefab modular units, which is kind of design build because we're designing them parallel with the GC who's actually building the foundations in the podium. And we're going to do that design build. So we're going to do schematic design for the foundations and podium, have that GC start that, and then have the prefab modular company start building their unit. We've already been kind of designing with them, but it's design build. And so the story is really that we're coming to the city with a design build project, even though they probably don't want it, and probably with their money, they're thinking they're going to get a design bid build, but what we're saying is you need design build because that's going to cut your time, is going to cut your construction time, and that was our proposal for you guys. So we'll see how that goes. Our interview's on Monday. Good luck.
Yeah, simple question. The density bonuses, that's primarily a city-based ordinance?
It's a state law.
It's a state?
So it's a great tool for going into cities that don't want affordable housing and are going to use their development standards and zoning requirements to try to stop it. They can't do that now
Yeah, so
within limits.
if they, through nitpicking, make it impossible, you have the option of going nuclear and just suing them, and then the state has sort of a backup set of bonuses that you can get, and you use those, which doesn't make you super popular with the planning department and city officials, but sometimes you just got to bite the bullet.
But some cities do that. So Santa Monica, we have a density bonus ordinance in the state, and I talked about what LA is doing. Santa Monica has its same density bonus ordinance, and I was just there trying to build something, and I said, hey, you guys have a density bonus ordinance. Why can't I make this project denser? And they said, oh, it's because it's in a C zone. And so they said the density bonus ordinance only for R zones, not C zones. And of course, but I'm not going to sue them. They also said that you can use the density bonus ordinance, but only if your parcel is this large or something. So I think, the state has to force, and I think this SB 50 that I was talking about is because the state has recognized that local neighborhoods are not doing enough. And so they're basically coming in and saying, hey, here's SB 50. You guys can build this density even if it's R1 if you're within a certain distance to transit.
So another tool that goes hand in hand with that is the housing element. of your city has a master plan, and one of the elements of the master plan is the housing element. And the state requires that cities every 7 years update their housing element based on projected population increases at different income levels, with the assumption that if your city is going to have more low-income people living there, then you need to have more sites that are zoned for a higher density, which would make low-income housing feasible. And I think right now there is not teeth to enforce that. And there have been lawsuits for cities that have not in good faith, executed a compliant housing element. I think Pleasanton and some other cities, I think there was a group that sued Fremont several years ago. But so I don't think it has any teeth yet, but most cities are going ahead and with their housing element, they have to identify which of their sites could feasibly have housing and zone to make that possible in advance, so.
The governor just threatened to withhold transportation money from the city of Huntington Beach. It was Huntington Beach, right? Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
In exciting Southern California news. So that hasn't necessarily gone through yet, but just the threat of withholding money to keep up the freeways, hopefully. Yeah. No dinner for you.
So we have time for one more question. Anyone have one final question?
I just have a very practical question. You talked about your group where you were doing spreadsheets.
Yeah.
And as an architect, I'm finding I need that tool. I need to be able to manage a pro forma. I need to be able to speak the same language as the developer so that I'm not under their thumb necessarily, which is what happens. So where can we get that information here? Where's the best way to get that school?
I don't know. Start it yourself. That's what we did. ELPN is kind of under an umbrella of a nonprofit housing advocacy and organization group. But all the younger folks realized that this is actually pretty hard and banded together and started a group to do networking and professional development support. And so, the people teaching us to do pro formas aren't pro forma consultants. It's young developers who recently learned how to do this themselves, and they're sharing what they know. And so I think everybody knows a little piece of the pie, and sharing the piece that you know is a good way to make sure that you know it really well, but also really helpful in how we all get smarter.
And I'm sorry, I can't help it, Karen. So when you went to school, did any of you take business classes? So now we're having to deal with all of these things that have to do with different kinds of budgeting, where does the money come from? How do we deal with, it's a lot different than casino building. It's a lot different than single-family homes. It's a lot different than commercial buildings. It's very different, and there's a lot of different language that you have to learn in this arena, right? So it goes anywhere from homeless and how do you shelter to how do you house, and then how do you go from homelessness to actual housing in a true affordable housing for middle income, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish I had a few business classes. I also, we read contracts too, and I didn't have any classes about that either, the law. But I had a client a couple years ago who asked me if I went to law school because I had a contract that was just ridiculous, and I crossed out most of it and sent it back. And this was a city. Most of the bad contracts come from cities. Is anyone a city employee here?
We love our city employees.
They're terrible. The contracts are terrible. They're written by city attorneys who have no idea. Yeah. Anyway, so, and I haven't gone to law school either, but you kind of learn it. But I've been an architect for 25 years. But I think part of it is that the education of an architect does need to change, and some schools are doing it. They have real estate and business and.
I only brought that up because the director for the School of Architecture is here.
There's one course that I did called mixed finance developments out of University of Maryland, College Park. And that was a very good course that taught me tax credits, public housing, all kinds of state funding, state bonds. But I don't know if that course was only once provided for a housing authority professional, paid for by HUD. And after the administration changed, they said HUD is not education provider, and they stopped that. I don't know if anybody knows such a course anywhere. No?
So I didn't have any sort of class that taught me this. It's mostly through ELPN, this organization, conferences that I've been to, and the fact that I married a guy who's worked in startups, which involves a lot of finance and contract language, so he's tutored me a little bit. I think things I wish I had studied in college would be basic accounting and technical writing. Oh my goodness. And nobody ever teaches you how to write an email. My first job, I asked my boss for help with this, and she was just floored that I didn't know how to write email, but it is an actual skill and kind of tricky to pick up. So
I will just add LISC. Remind me what LISC stands for.
sustainable community.
Low-Income Sustainable Communities, which is a nationwide organization, and there's probably a chapter here. I know a lot of the developers that hire us, they send their staff to trainings by LISC. So it might be an idea to send one person to a training and then start a group where they can share what they learned.
Thank you. We're getting the hook from 2, so it's time to go. But thank you very much. If we could please thank our guests for coming in.
Yes, Angela, Caroline, and Teresa, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
The conversation was wonderful. Let's see, what's next? I'd like to thank our sponsors, thank Southern Nevada Strong for hosting us. We've got something coming up in, 22 days now? National Conference on Architecture, 22 days. Hope to see you all out there doing various activities, volunteering, and all the fun stuff. And then in August, we'll be back, I forget the exact date, but we'll be back with the design charrette. We're working with the city of Las Vegas, so we'd like to have your participation with that. Thank you all, and have a good night.